Well, Jeff Bezos has bought part of Liverpool FC. We'll talk transfer budgets and SCR. Is it unfair on those poor whittled clubs like Newcastle and Aston Villa? And how much have United spent in the transfer window, and could we afford it? This is United Inc. with Jamie. How's it going, Jamie?
Yeah, I'm good, Ed. Looking forward to the start of the new season. We are a few hours away from that with Arsenal versus Coventry, and I've thankfully just finished my fantasy football team. The first iteration had a surprising number of Chelsea players, which I've rectified that, and I've gone heavy on Arsenal, and maybe this is just early season optimism. I do have 3 United players in my team for the first time, I want to say, in about 6 years.
Very good. Well, Arsenal have 8 centre-backs on the books. Can you name them all for a special prize? And it's not even junior ones. They're all senior players, and 4 of them will be considered full-backs. So
I could give it a stab, but this is literally because I've got short-term memory from doing my team. Because you'd have what? Gabriel Saliba, Timber, Calafiori, White, Konza, Hincapié,
Mosquera.
Mosquera, yeah, that's the other one.
There's a couple others. I'm totally forgetting for a second there. Yeah, it's incredible. I wish there's a game where they play all of them at the same time. It'd be awesome. Yeah, just
you
classic.
never know.
Yeah,
I wouldn't put it past
full meat wall turned up to 11. All right, well, we're not here to talk about Arsenal tactics, dog shit though they are. We're here to talk about finances. So, is the consortium that's bought into Liverpool the richest ever? We've got Bezos worth near 300 billion. We've got it's Amit Bhatia, but the Mittal family, basically 20 billion conservatively, maybe even more. Eduardo Saverin, whose wealth comes from spending about 6 months at Facebook just as they were being born. His story is told in The Social Network, if you remember that film. And a few others. It's a hugely wealthy consortium.
Correct me if I've got any of these figures wrong, Ed, but I think it's a $7.4 billion valuation.
Yeah.
So, and the deal is for just under 40% of Liverpool. So, as we were doing this discussion, I was quickly trying to look at my notes to see how much Bezos made up of the consortium. I think it's around 50% is a number that we landed on, right?
Something like that. It's a bit hard to... Actually, the reporting was a bit all over the place, so it might take a while. I guess if I'd not been lazy... Well, actually, no, because Liverpool are not on the stock exchanges, so I couldn't look up anything. That's why, yeah. Normally you can look up a sales agreement, but this is a private transaction. So, yeah, something like that. Maybe it'll come out in the reporting. It's... What did you make of it? Because Bezos he's a value investor, right? For as rich as he is, he's sniffed around sports clubs of various stripes for a while now and always backed away from it. And he's not had any problem with the money. He could buy an NFL team, an NBA team, a hockey team, like anything he wants. There's no problem with that. So, and he's always gone sort of no because he felt like the price was high. But this price it values Liverpool at like £5.5 billion, right? So it's a big deal.
Yeah, and so on the valuation, it's not a million miles away from what we were valued at when Sir Jim Ratcliffe and Ineos invested. I think on an enterprise value multiple, so EV to sales, it's lower, but on an equity basis, so just if you strip away the net debt that we had, it's probably in the same ballpark, maybe a touch ahead, depending on currency conversions, etc. I think that's, first of all, a reflection of the work that FSG have done at the club, taking it from pretty much near bankruptcy,
right?
15, 16 years ago, which we can touch on later in some of the other conversations that we're going to have. But to take it from that to where they are now in such a short period of time is pretty rare.
Especially in football.
Exactly. And what does it, why is Bezos getting involved now? Well, look, I think you've still got two big factors, right? If you take the kind of investment case as to why you would go after a big football club, first of all, it's deemed to be AI proof and actually probably aided by AI when you think about the internal operations of a football team. still an industry which, relative to US sports, is under commercialized. So I think there would be an argument, even though the TV money is clearly slowing, there is definitely an argument to say, well, could commercial revenue still rise and potentially match day revenue? Obviously, there's probably a philosophical debate whether that should rise.
Yep.
But there's still pockets of growth, and if you can operate it pretty efficiently like Liverpool have, then actually you've got you're making an investment where the value of the club could still rise. And as you say, in this landscape, with the investor pool that you've probably got as close to all the funding you are ever going to need, at least for the next 10 to 20 years, to be able to invest in that squad. And also in the women's team.
Absolutely, and they paid off some debt as part of the transaction as well, so Liverpool are effectively debt-free, something like that at the moment. It's a stark contrast with the United purchase, where the multi-party ownership has actually caused more problems, not fewer problems, in that there's no real way for Ratcliffe to come in and pay off United's debt or really inject more cash at all. I mean, it's that $300 million that was injected as part of the initial deal, really because he paid quite a high premium. That was why 2% equity, that otherwise any other purchase would go just straight into the Glazers' pockets and not into the club. And so we're left with what feels like a bit of a millstone until something changes. And Liverpool are actually in a very strong financial position. I think there's, obviously a lot of excitement online amongst Liverpool fans who think this means that all the money of God is going to turn up in their transfer budget, and that's not going to be the case, right? They are still going to run from operational cash, as you would expect, and especially under an SCR like kind of ratio. How much, I can forget again now how much owners can put in, but it's still limited, right, in terms of how much actual owner equity can be put in. So maybe there'll be some short-term investment, but I think over time you've got a bunch of value investors there that see probably an undervaluation. Like you, I'm a bit dubious on whether they can actually start to price this like US sports, because US sports, as we saw with the World Cup, are really high, except MLS. You can still go to MLS for $20, but everything else is, even college sports, eye-wateringly expensive in British terms. And so, we'll see what they can do there. But it's not for Liverpool fans listening, the one or two of you, it's not a bad scenario to be in. For United fans wanting some copium here, or maybe Bezos has got billionaire dickhead syndrome, has no idea how to operate a football club, although he has no place on the board or anything like that. And Amit Bhatia, who you may remember had a catastrophic time as partial owner of Queen's Park Rangers with Flavio Briatore, which was comically bad. Maybe he's learned something over the years.
Yeah, I think on that specific point, I actually, if I was a Liverpool fan, I would actually quite like that, in the sense that, you've seen some mistakes, and so you've got some of those scar tissues to not make them again. If I put your Man United fan hat on, the risk here with this deal for Liverpool fans is you've had a very clear strategy up until the last few years, which has been data-driven, data-led. The likes of Ian Graham, and the fact that, people who were in the canteens cooking players' food knew who he was, said everything about the strategic direction of that club. Will they move away from that, or will they continue to operate in the same way? The last few years, I would argue their transfer strategy has been a little bit more muddled and not necessarily as clear as it was in the early days of the Klopp era. So I'd say that actually is probably the biggest risk here, is that, say they take the option that they've got for the rest of the club, or for a majority of the club. As soon as they start to make changes, operational changes to the organisation, there is clearly going to be a risk that things start to go, or you start to have a rough patch. And you're seeing that at other clubs at the moment.
Yep, it can turn around very quickly. Highly data-driven clubs that change their strategy, suddenly it becomes a bit difficult. One of the other things that has come up is that Amazon had, I don't think they have this year, correct me if I'm wrong, part of the TV deal for the Premier League. They've certainly had an interest there before. Is there a conflict of interest with Bezos? He's not in operational control of Amazon anymore, but still has a controlling share, I believe. So is that a problem, right? I mean, we go all the way back to, I was around at the time, delivering thousands of pizzas to B offices and all sorts of other naughty shenanigans that we got into when the Murdoch deal was almost going through. And that was obviously blocked by the Mergers and Competitions Authority at the time. Is this a conflict of interest?
Look, I think that's going to be one for the IFR to unpack. And
regulator, yeah.
Exactly. And I've tweeted about this, but I think the timing here, the difference with the B deal is the timing, in the sense of B were already the incumbent, domestic broadcaster for the Premier League, and then they were trying to acquire us. Here, that's not quite the same, and assuming Bezos owned 50% or is 50% investor of the consortium, then he owns 19%, and so he would fall under the kind of position of influence test that the IFR would do, which I think is set at 25%. So it's a slightly different dynamic, but it's one that I think does need to be looked at and probably should be scrutinised by the IFR. And look, again, that's good. Potentially has some ramifications for the rest of the league in terms of, okay, will media rights, at least domestically, be bid up continually if you don't have a player like Amazon Prime at the table?
Yeah, it's a really interesting strategic question about, I've been involved in some of these deals over the years, but about how you think about share of wallet as a non-entertainment provider, right? So Amazon Studio, obviously they bought MGM, they have a bigger media presence than they once did. It was always a kind of add value to Amazon Prime, which is an incredibly valuable strategic asset for them. We just think of it as free delivery, but it drives an incredible amount of revenue on its own, and then Prime members are unbelievably good customers. Just sticky, will buy anything from Amazon, doesn't matter if it's more expensive elsewhere, and so on. And the question was always like, how do you create more value for Prime members to keep them? And in a market like the UK, where there's such massive saturation of Prime members, and I know this from the inside, the way they were thinking was, does this actually drive any value or not doing this? And this is why they put the toe in the water rather than try and go all out for the rights, because they're like, we can't really drive many more Prime members. Like, everyone's got a Prime membership, basically. In other markets, that is not true, and it might be a better play for them. We've seen Netflix getting into sport as well. They may become a real player. So is Apple. They really did dip their toe in the water with the MLS deal, which is massively undervalued, I think. And so will they keep bidding up? So the time when media rights in the UK for domestic rights for the Premier League really, really rose was when there was very strong competition between Sky and BT, basically. That has changed. Obviously, BT are no longer a TV player, really. They've sold those assets off because they didn't make them any money. And so you could get a scenario where it looks like there's really only one bidder, and the Premier League really need competition in order to keep those rights driving high. But it's so core to Sky's proposition that you can't really see them not bidding. Right? Yeah. It's like the whole thing, really. So it is an interesting one. I don't know whether the new Liverpool owners, come back to the original question, have a view on like whether there's more like juice to be squeezed out of this one or not, because I don't know. I look at these football clubs and I'm like, wait, real value is still tied so much to being successful in all competitions. Like the media proposition, as in the club's media presence or brand presence, it felt like that would have been tapped out, but maybe they've got a different view on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for the domestic rights, I think the next leg up could be if the 3 p.m. blackout gets removed. Yeah. That might be the next leg up, and that it might be like last time, where that is actually just a kind of nominal increase in the value, but price per game stays flat, or maybe
last time when they massively increased the number of available games.
Exactly. So like that might be the next leg domestically, but yeah, you're right. Internationally, there will then, there is a question, but the powers of the IFR, as I understand them, will be specifically related to the domestic game, and so that also might be the play here in terms of from an international exposure perspective of Liverpool.
Mm-hmm.
If Amazon Prime become the kind of de facto media rights provider internationally, depending on whether the Premier League roll out the Singapore direct consumer model,
mm-hmm.
Maybe it's actually Amazon are providing the infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
For that. Those will all be things at play, because actually, if then you've got Amazon Prime providing the infrastructure, they're an important player. What does that mean for Liverpool games shown abroad in markets like India and elsewhere? That's where there could be influence. That's where, there's then potentially the question of, do Liverpool have an unfair advantage due to their ownership?
Let's move on a little bit from Liverpool. Enough talk about them. Disgusting. United transfers and budget. So we have spent money, reasonable money, not actually really big money in current terms, on three midfielders, almost three midfielders. Yuri Tielemans, about 35 million. Andre Santos, 50, including the add-ons. And Carlos Baleba, we assume he's coming in because United let it be known through their favourite channels that this is almost done at 65 plus whatever they have to add on to get Brighton to move. And I guess we assume that a cheapo left back will be coming in, probably not Lewis Hall anymore, but some kind of support for Luke Shaw in the final part of the window. It's a reasonably conservative summer so far. What does this mean for United's sort of financial position and SCR position?
I think the thing here is, let's just take this in two parts, right? What might they do in the next couple of weeks? I think, given the lack of sales of Rashford and Ugarte,
Xerxes,
to a lesser extent, I feel like there is probably a little bit of wiggle room to do some deals, but not all that much. And I think it will ultimately, it's going to depend on their risk appetite as to whether they do another deal and how they do that deal. So what I mean by that is, do they choose to actually just make another buy without moving anyone on? Because that then puts a risk on the overall wage bill, right? Yeah. The structure of the wage bill, I think, is in a much healthier position. But the reality is, with us being in the Champions League, and also, the fact that really the only reduction in the wage bill this year is Casemiro, which is more than offset by Rashford coming back. Mm-hmm. All the signings that we've made is actually additive to the wage bill. So with that regards, that then has a cash implication. And so, we are where we were last year, in so much that, we can probably, we will be able to cover that the transfer payables that we have for the historic deals over the next 12 months. But in order to keep the rebuild going on the same pace, we will need either the ownership structure to change or Champions League football once again. Now, they will be running their models on, the percentage probability of how likely we are to get top 4, top 5 based on the signings that everyone has done. Mm-hmm. I think a left back would be nice. I have reservations about going for a left back that is too budget or too much of a value play, because I think ultimately we are still going to, if that doesn't work out, we're still going to have to go big on a left back, like first choice left back, specialist left back. And we could easily end up being in a position like we were with Malacia, where you've got a player that you just can't move on.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I did a mini video on this, dropped earlier today, today being Friday, the 21st of August, just thinking about that kind of strategy, because it's an interesting one. Because let's just say you have 20 or 30 million to spend that you're happy to do. I'm making that number up, but like some smaller sized deal. Is it a better strategy to spend that on a young, high-ceiling player the data team likes, like Jorge Salinas at Racing Santander is the one in the press a lot? He's got a 16 million euro buyout clause. Real Madrid apparently interested. Blah blah blah. Right? Don't know anything about it. But let's just that kind of scenario. Or is it better to spend it on Teles Mark II and find a slightly older player from Europe somewhere, give them a 3 or 4 year contract, and you could find out, they're not quite good enough, and we have to buy Lewis Hall next summer anyway, and then we've got this player on relatively high wages that we would rather not have. And it is a difficult one, because I think the instinct of fans would be buy the young kids, give them a go, give them a chance. But that's also very, very risky, right? We had Harry Amas, seems like the club doesn't think he's quite good enough. Diego Leon we brought in, seems like the club don't think he's good enough because he's not made it to the first team or even the bench or anything like that. So it is an interesting question, but it's a massive risk point, as you say. So if you were doing a calculation of risk, Luke Shaw getting crocked and having no left back, it's a massive risk. And I'm not sure either of us really want Diogo Dalot at left back away at the Bernabeu in the Champions League.
No, I mean, look, this is probably more of a revolutionary idea, but I would be more inclined for us to try and move on Lisandro Martinez as an example, and have Shaw as kind of a big game or backup option for the left centre back, because that then gives you not only the funds to go out and buy your specialist left back, but also the capacity on the wage bill.
Mm-hmm.
To me, feels like a much more prudent option to be taking, despite all of the kind of positive attributes that Martinez gives us. I actually think, if Shaw's only paying 50% of the games, that's actually not a bad position to be in.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought, given that Martinez only plays 50% of the games historically, and we have Aidan Heaven coming through strongly, and Yoro is actually better at left centre-back, I think, than right centre-back, even though he's kind of, everyone's thinking about him as an alternate for Harry Maguire. So in the final week or so of the transfer window, I think Carrick kind of dead-batted a question about Rashford on Thursday, whenever it was, when he was asked again. He was actually asked, which is a naughty question, I've got to say, has Rashford asked for a move away? He's just not going to say anything about that, is he? There's some thought that Barcelona might want to do a straight loan again, with maybe an obligation, which they didn't take up last time, or option. What would that mean? I mean, it would take the wages off the books if they did that, but then presumably reduce the quality in the squad for because you can't reinvest it in a purchase. Like, it's not 15 million a year with no guarantee of selling later. You can't really go and buy another player.
No, I think Turkey is probably another option out there, because they're clearly, the Turkish clubs are clearly in the market for a winger, if you look at what's going on with Gabriel Martinelli.
Yep.
Look, I think actually a loan for Rashford right now doesn't really help us.
Right.
Because for that point, right, we actually have a lot of flexibility up front now, and they're probably saying that, okay, we don't depending on what happens with Xerxes, you don't necessarily have a backup striker, but you have a lot of tactical flexibility as to who could play there, whether that's Cunha or Mbumo, and you've still got cover in left wing, right wing, if one of those played up front. So, just loaning Rashford, to me, at this stage of the window, seems like the only reason you would do it is to save on the wages, so that you're de-risking the financials for next summer. And when you think about how many games we could be playing and the tactical flexibility that we will need, it doesn't stack up for me.
No, I came to the same conclusion as well. Of course, there's the emotional reaction from a lot of fans who, for whatever reason, have a negative opinion of Marcus Rashford. That's one thing. But the financial piece, it doesn't make any sense. You could only really loan in another player, or you take the risk of buying another player and not being able to sell Rashford next summer. And could you buy a player? 28 goals and assists last season. What would it cost you to buy a player that can produce those kind of numbers? Now, I think the assumption is he's going to play a squad role. We've got Cunha and Dorgu both available on that wing. He seems happy to do that. If he's happy to do that, and Michael Carrick knows him, has played with him, and it's harmonious in the squad, and whatever issues he had before, well discussed, don't rear their head again, then it's just about performance on the pitch, right? And we should all get over ourselves about whether he pressed enough or tracked back enough 2 years ago now. This is a finance show, right? So the money does matter, and he's probably the best paid player at the club, right? Until Bruno gets his new contract. And maybe that in Ineos terms, they're thinking about value for money in each position. Maybe that doesn't stack up, but as you say, it's very hard to get better value by buying another player in. The other one that we may see change is Xerxes. There is some interest there. His book value is probably less than 20 million now, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it wouldn't be a big transfer to net it out, even if it's a loan with an obligation of some kind. Let's say loan to Juventus, cover the wages, small loan fee. He goes there permanently next summer for 20 million euros if they qualify for the Champions League. Like that kind of scenario might be quite likely.
Yeah, and I think, it'll be, as I say, it all depends on their risk appetite in terms of whether they decide to reinvest that elsewhere. Because I think if Xerxes leaves, I think that will immediately lead a lot of fans to say, oh, we can buy a backup striker. As I say, if Rashford isn't going anywhere, he's also an option for through the middle.
As is Mbeumo. In fact, I think we'll see Mbeumo play through the middle quite a bit.
Exactly. And so, I would probably err on the side of, well, if you're fairly sure you've got those funds coming in, actually that's then your kind of top up with whatever excess we've got left over to go after that specialist level.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think United are in a reasonable position compared to 3 years ago. The finances are in a much more rational position at the moment. We'll see what happens with Rashford over time. Maybe he absolutely smashes it this year and then it looks like good value. They could offer him a longer contract at a more sensible wage. Be interesting if he was willing to take that. He certainly was for Barcelona. Or we may get a shock on the last day and he gets loaned off to Barcelona. Let's talk about some other transfer stuff then, because there's some interesting shenanigans going on in the Premier League this summer. United are now the only Big Six side to have not spent £100 million on a player, although if you put it in, if you go onto Kieran Maguire's transfer inflation calculator on Value Ball, then of course Pogba was, in today's terms, well over that, and a few other players as well. But in terms of actual cash, still haven't spent £100 million on a player. Unlikely we drop £100 million in the next week or so.
Sounds pretty unlikely.
Arsenal spent huge money on Bruno Guimaraes, who's 29, which is an interesting win now strategy that has no value down the line. Liverpool, obviously, they haven't gone really big this summer, but they may well do if they're still interested in Bradley Barcoa. Chelsea seem to drop £100 million on a player every other week. Despite being under a UEFA settlement agreement, we should talk about that.
Yeah.
Aston Villa just sell players, but presumably they are now going to spend silly money on Nicholas Jackson. And that's not dodgy at all. And when we talk about dodgy transfers, Savinho from City to Tottenham for 85 million, and then Marmoush at the same time to Tottenham for 2 pence or whatever it is. Very odd, Jamie. Very odd. What's going on in the Premier League at the moment?
Which one of those do you want me to start with?
I don't know. I just thought I'd list all the corruption going on. Let's start with Spurs, because they are the interesting. Yeah. They spent a lot of money this summer after finishing in the bottom third of the table 2 years in a row.
Yeah, and I think with depending on where the final numbers shake out on Savinho and Marmoush, and whether they also complete Gakpo, they are going to be spending north of kind of net probably about 250 million quid this year. That is, for as big as high revenue Tottenham generate, that is an incredible amount of money to be spending in its own right. Specifically on those two deals, I do understand it looks a little bit fishy. And look, the reality is, whether they are moving funds, or, moving value from Marmoush to Savinho to please City, the reality is it's saving City, a couple of million best. Yeah. And that's if you subscribe to the view that Marmoush is even worth, has increased in value. I think the overall conclusion here for me is Tottenham are paying whatever they need to pay to satisfy the selling club to be able to improve their own squad.
Yep.
And then when we think about what that means for the rest of the league and squad cost rule, actually, the fact that there are big teams with owners willing to spend money is a good thing for the rest of the league, because it's actually getting some teams out of trouble when it comes to their kind of overall profit and loss position. Yeah, every summer I kind of go into it thinking, right, what's the next leg of money that's going to circulate round to help a bunch of teams out? This year, in the past it's been Saudi, it's also been Turkey. This year, and sorry, Chelsea as well. This year, it's looking like Tottenham.
Yeah.
And one of the big things to be aware of here is the fact that the Premier League squad cost ratio rules don't have anything related to swap deals.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're in a UEFA competition, that makes a massive difference. But if you're not, then actually it probably does just make sense to spend a bunch of money to try and get closer to that. And look, I haven't run the numbers yet on Spurs, but the clear conclusion for me here is they're spending the type of money which means that they kind of need to get Champions League football.
They can go to the 85% ratio. They can push it even further than that. They may well be doing that, but it has a knock-on effect down the line in following years if they don't get that revenue. But they probably improved their squad enough that they'll be knocking on the door of European football. Their defence looks probably better, though they've lost Romero, who's been a very important player for them. They've certainly had a lot of quality in midfield with Tonali and Fernandes, and I guess Gallagher is permanent now, isn't it?
Yeah,
I don't know if he's that good, really. Savinho's the interesting one because he's got 3 goals over 2 years. I mean, it's obviously like he didn't quite fit in Pep's system. Pep worked that out very quickly. City have this uncanny ability to take their failed players and make a profit on them. It's just absolutely uncanny. If you were very cynical, you'd wonder what was going on, but I guess let's be generous and say it's the halo effect of City. And people just wanting their players because they're generally successful, even the cast-offs. So, yeah, Spurs are taking a risk. Chelsea, can we talk about them? Because they are under a settlement agreement. They do have to find sales. They are about 100 million net at the moment, up, not down. So does that mean inevitably that Enzo Fernandez will be sold in the next week? And where's the destination?
Yeah, so, look, destination unknown, to quite a famous song for a certain viewer. Yeah, I need to look at all of the transfers, but yeah, they're probably a kind of net profit in terms of player trading at kind of just over 100 million, which means they probably need another 50, maybe a touch less, at a bare minimum, assuming they qualify for the Champions League. For that to happen, Fernandes does need to be going for probably about 120, 130 million. And I think the interesting thing to point out here is makes competitive sense for the Premier League teams. If they're going to spend big money, it makes competitive sense for them to recycle that money on Premier League players. Mm-hmm. As soon as you start, for the big boys at least, buying players from different countries, you're effectively having money leave the ecosystem and strengthening, your continental competitors. And that, to me, seems to be the clear trend from this, because all of the big deals pretty much have been Premier League club to Premier League club. And I'd be surprised if that didn't continue. You might see, obviously, the occasional deal where, a big team buys big from abroad, but I wouldn't expect it to be common trend, because Premier League media rights does slow, they're kind of giving away their competitive advantage. What you are more likely to see is those teams kind of 8th and down exerting their financial muscle across Europe.
Yeah, I think that's a fair call on that one. Premier League has certainly been seen as an ATM for other leagues. Like if you look at how much La Liga, Serie A, and Bundesliga, let's forget Liga because they don't spend anything. But for the other three big leagues, it is seen as an ATM. It's fueling some of their cash needs. Turkey's obviously kind of come into that with their tax rules and some very wealthy local investors and stuff like that. We'll see whether that actually, apart from a few headline deals, I don't know whether it's really increasing the quality of that league yet. We will see on that one. But you're right on the recirculation. I don't know that Premier League clubs are going, isn't it better if we circulate amongst the Premier League for our competitiveness of the league overall? What they are doing, though, is looking at quality. The quality of the Premier League is so high now that it's hard to get better if you're a top team, like from outside. I mean, United have bought 3 from inside the Premier League. They may do a cheap outside deal for a left back from outside the Premier League, but it may, who knows? Maybe Anthony Robinson is the guy, and that'd be cheap from inside the league. So we'll see on that one. But yeah, I think it is an interesting dynamic for amongst all the Premier League clubs. Chelsea, one to watch on the sale there. I mean, I guess it's probably City rather than Real Madrid because Real Madrid didn't sell Tchouaméni. So they haven't got room in their squad really to buy another. There's no one else. It's not Barcelona, that's for sure. They've already spent their big money on Anthony Gordon of all players. Who else? Spurs, Chelsea.
And Rodri.
And Rodri, of course. Rodri, yeah. I guess an interesting one, Rodri, because they can't really afford it, Barcelona. I guess they can in terms of, you look at their revenue, but they're a significant amount of that revenue they sold on to other partners. So. Who else in the top 6? So Arsenal just done that deal for Guimaraes. Chelsea, we've talked about. City, watch on Enzo Fernandez and Boadi over the next 7 days. They could do both of those deals. That won't be a problem for them. Aston Villa just absolutely selling everybody. Yeah. And yet, if I was a Villa fan, I'm not necessarily sure I'm going to panic about that. I mean, Nicholas Jackson, if they buy him, it may well be an interesting premium to recirculate some of that Morgan Rogers money. But he's a very good player. Streaky, flaky with his finishing, but I think a better player than he's often given credit for.
Yeah, well, look, I think with that deal in particular, it's interesting because with the player trading that Villa have done at the moment, they are probably touching close to 200 million. I think the last tally I did was 175 million. So biggest ever in the Premier League. And that includes the Ezri Konsa deal.
Yeah.
So I think that there is potential, an outside chance that they could come out of their settlement agreement with UEFA a year early. If they did a deal for Nicholas Jackson, then basically all of the profit that they would have got from the Morgan Rogers deal wipes itself out because they would then effectively have a swap deal in the eyes of UEFA between Nicholas Jackson and Morgan Rogers. So that was always been...
And Garnacho.
Well, yeah, although that's a conditional obligation, so slightly...
Yeah. So
they can
get around the rules there, yeah.
They can game that one if they want to. Mm-hmm. So that's been the thing in my mind where I've had the thought that they'd probably be unlikely to do the Jackson deal because the value of coming out of their settlement agreement in terms of the flexibility that gives them in subsequent years is probably more than Nicholas Jackson, although what they'll be probably weighing up is the chances of getting top 5 if they sign Nicholas Jackson versus if they don't and stay as they are.
Yeah, and Ollie Watkins' future as well. I mean, certainly links with Saudi in the past week, yeah. United may well be the only top 6 side as well to not benefit from the Saudi ATM. I mean, obviously we've got Ronaldo's wages off the books. Does that count?
And Alex Telles.
Oh, yeah, for 2 million euros or whatever it was. Yeah. Whatever denomination they work in for that one. All right. Well, we want to have a little chat before we go about SCR generally and where it's anti-competitive. I have to say this bugs me, this view, right? So it is, in a sense, anti-competitive because it places a glass ceiling there for all teams, which is based on their revenue. And yet, you can do things to increase your revenue. So Villa If you spend any time in North Birmingham, I don't know why anyone would, but are doing work on Villa Park at the moment to improve it and expand it. Newcastle have just spent 200 million on a new training ground facility. They're still, it seems, in negotiation with the local council to buy part of Laziz Park to move St James's Park a couple hundred yards further north and expand that. So there are ways to grow. And I pick on those two clubs because they're the ones whose fans moan the most about being forced to sell players because of SCR. Of course, you could just not buy other players. I mean, that's how it works, right? So is this unfair, and why is it unfair if it is?
Look, I err on the side of it's not, and that's coming from a place of where I place more value on the overall financial sustainability of football clubs in general.
Yep.
And this is proving to be the most effective form of regulation in doing that, because it does put a control on player wages and transfer fees.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I totally get the argument that, okay, look, if you've got more revenue, then you've got a bigger budget to be able to spend it. But we're currently seeing in the Premier League the most tumultuous time across biggest clubs in terms of, if you look at managerial changes, if you look at squad evolution, those risks are always going to be there. We are the bastion for, okay, we've got a big budget, but if you don't spend it well, kind of meaningless, right? And if you actually, I think the perceived bigger clubs have an inherent advantage because their fan base is naturally bigger, but that's been built up over decades. There's nothing preventing any football team doing that. And I think also when you look at how the financials have evolved of those big teams, apart from probably Chelsea, they have all had a period where they haven't been up. They've basically taken pain. So Arsenal with the stadium in the Emirates, there was 20 years where they were to be paying for that stadium. Yep. Liverpool, as we touched on earlier, nearly went bankrupt in 2010 until FSG came in. Themselves, that financial dominance was basically on the back of continued investment in kind of land and the stadium in the 90s, but that's predicated because our overall transfer need was lower because we had the class of 92.
Mm-hmm.
Who else am I missing? Tottenham. They, infamously built this new stadium and had years of pretty frugal management. Yep. To put them in a position where they had a revenue advantage.
Although
City,
they got an unbelievably good bond deal. Spurs did, just unbelievably good, just perfect timing. So, but they're paying a price for that, but it's a very low one.
The relative equilibrium that there is in terms of the distribution of media rights does give every Premier League team a financial advantage across the world.
Yeah.
Across world football. Aston Villa, as I've said multiple times on this podcast, had the 10th biggest wage bill in global football. Bournemouth have bought players that, Juventus were looking at. I completely get the argument that you want to at least have the perception that anyone can win the Premier League. But I would argue at the moment we're pretty much seeing that it is about as competitive as it has ever been.
Mm-hmm.
And things fluctuate. So, I don't know, my instinct says that when you're trying to balance up competitiveness and financial sustainability, the SCR rule isn't that bad, particularly also when you look at how it's adjudicated on.
Yeah.
The fines that you get for breaching SCR are so much lower than a PSR breach.
Yeah, I think that's right. Baked in, so we all know, but it's in a way that PSR, FFP, God, in acronyms, acronym soup. In a way, we didn't know what the punishments were. It was unclear. There was some opaqueness and looseness around the rules, which was deliberate. And now this is pretty clear, what happens on first breach and second breach and so on, whether you're in the green zone or the red zone. And so we can all be really clear about that. And it's a bit looser than UEFA as well in terms of what you can do, right? So selling assets to yourself, you can. Some assets. Under UEFA regs, you cannot. And so on. And there's absolutely nothing on the squad cost rule. As I said earlier, if rich owners want to invest in everything other than football players, there's nothing stopping them, right? There's absolutely nothing stopping Villa's owners expanding Villa Park if they want to, right? that will bring in more revenue, or spending money on overseas marketing to generate a bigger audience overseas, which will then generate more commercial revenue. Nothing stopping them at all, right? It's not going to factor into the squad costs. They can spend as much money as they like on everything else, which will increase the value of their club overall, and that creates long-term sustainable growth if they want to be competitive with the so-called red cartel, which also includes 2 blue clubs.
Yeah. And I think the other counterfactual here is that, well, okay, say, for instance, you had a fixed wage bill, or salary cap effectively, like you do in US sports, which you'll know all about.
Mm-hmm.
Let's think about what might happen there in terms of, well, okay, in order for you to spend that, you need spend that money consistently and be able to fund it over a number of years. You need incredibly wealthy owners. What if their circumstances change, right? The nature of transfer dealings nowadays is that most players are signed on 5 to potentially 8 years, if you're Chelsea, contracts. Are you going to ask for a liquidity buffer for 8 years? Because the liabilities that a club has signed up to will invariably outlast an owner.
Mm-hmm.
And at some point then, with the numbers being so big, you've kind of only got a few options as to who your owners are.
Mm-hmm.
It's the ultra high net worth individuals, or whatever level Jeff Bezos is, or the professional investors.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's more of the professional investors, you've then got a scenario where at some point they're going to want to return.
Yep.
And they're going to have to drive. They will have to drive revenue and more sustainable finances anyway.
Yeah, well, absolutely, and we're seeing some of that dynamic play out at Chelsea at the moment. Clearlake will have to exit at some point, right? There's been some, it's interesting how it's reported. So Todd Bowley and one of the other investors are selling their personal shares in Chelsea to Clearlake, the investment company which they run. Of course, Clearlake also uses other people's money, right? Because it's an investment company, not just their own. So that's the change there. Interesting that they decided to exit at this point. But Clearlake will exit at some point too, because that's the only way they return money to their LPs. Now, it's a longer hold than, say, a venture fund, just about-ish, sort of. But it's also, in theory, less risky. Unless you pull a Chelsea, then maybe it's not. So, yeah, interesting. I do wonder, like, maybe last word on this, whether the change in Liverpool will be... Because it's interesting, like, FSG did a really good job, turned things around, but they are slow exiting. Right? They'll probably exit their full position in the next 12 months, right? It's clearly signalled that that's going to happen. Whether that will have a knock-on effect for other investors around, because there's half the Liga now owned by American investors, either as part of a family office or some kind of investment vehicle. We've just seen Ipswich come into the league, basically owned by a pension fund. So whether that'll have a knock-on effect, whether people are like, okay, that sets the benchmark for the value, everyone's boats are rising, whether some of those will exit, who knows, unclear, or whether they still think there's more juice to squeeze.
Yeah, but I think, even if they do exit, you've still got this issue in terms of the costs now to run. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The costs to run it are so high. And this is throughout the Football League pyramid, right? Like, even if you're own, I think, a League Two club, I think the average losses are somewhere between 5 and 7 million pounds a year. Yeah. So to stand still, as we currently are, probably need 50 million quid to own it for 5 years. That's before you think about infrastructure investment. Mm-hmm. That is well beyond a local business traditional local business person.
Yeah, even in the Championship. Right? So over the last 10 years, Championship clubs have lost something like £3.3 billion, and owners have put in about £3.3 billion, right? So owners are funding entirely the Championship's losses. That deal between the Premier League and the Championship still not signed, but I think there's a framework of an agreement of some kind.
Yeah, we'll see whether it goes through.
Yeah, we'll see. Yeah, but without really tight financial controls, all that will do will be prune juice. To quote Alan Sugar, it will just go into wages, and you'll see a bunch of Championship players. You'll still see losses at Championship clubs, which may be smaller as a percentage, but the same in cash terms, and you will just see donkeys in the Championship earning 50 grand a week. All right? I don't think that's more sustainable, and that's probably obviously the biggest argument from Premier League clubs with Championship is we just don't want to give you any more money. But the second argument is you're just going to come cap in hand in 5 years' time for more money unless this is really tightly regulated.
Yeah, I mean, look, I would expect the squad cost rule that's coming into the Championship and the salary cost management protocol, I don't know why they've got different names, in League One and League Two. I think a condition of the Premier League giving the EFL more money is going to be tighter, stricter management of those ratios to avoid a situation. They're not going to want to come together on a new deal in 5 years' time, right? Like it just does not work.
Yeah. Well, look, here's the classic, right? This is Gary Neville. He made two arguments at the same time. Part owner of Salford. I'm actually not sure how much he owns anymore because they sold a whole bunch of it off. He argued both for more money for the Premier League and that owners should be able to spend as much money as they like, right? At the same time, right? It's a ridiculous argument if you want a sustainable industry. It just is. And I also don't think. I mean, of course, the jumping quality between the Premier League and the Championship is an issue for clubs coming up, right? The chances are that the three clubs that came up are the three clubs that go down, right? That is an issue. And without some gradated, financial system, which we're not going to get, parachute payments are the only way to manage that. And it's kind of clunky, really. But why should the Championship be the 7th or 8th best league in Europe? Which it basically is. It's probably on ELO rankings, it's ranked higher than the Dutch league. Wages are probably higher than the Dutch league. It doesn't make any sense. And I know you get really good crowds in the Championship, and it's partly because people are priced out of the Premier League now, partly, and also it's just the history of football in England. But I don't think there's any reason why the second league has to be that good, other than you don't really want a yo-yo situation in which the top three always go down again.
I think you want a competitive pyramid, but it's like the thing that I always just come back to, it's at what cost?
Yeah.
Right. And I think it's going to be incredibly difficult to have this utopian world where it is perfectly gradiated through the league system. Kind of have to have a natural bit of fluctuation. Mm-hmm. And then this is the other thing I forgot to mention earlier is that if the losses are continue to be so big, that drive to increase revenue is going to increase. That will have a direct impact on match day tickets because it's the easiest way clubs can drive revenue because they know it's somewhat of a guaranteed revenue stream. And do you want a scenario where it's so expensive where say you make bad player choices, there's no incentive for a team to really do that much better or any of the players because they're on great wages anyway, and they'll find a place. Kind of what happens in US sports, right? Obviously, it's different with the draft system, but there reaches a point in the season where you're almost incentivized to bomb out.
Yeah.
And no one turns up to the games, and then you're like, well, that's a direct impact on the quality of the product.
Yeah. You can turn up to a baseball game in September or something like that, and there'd be 12 people in there, basically, because it just doesn't mean anything. And what's the point? It's a really fucking boring sport as well, but that's a different argument altogether. Yeah. So, yeah. And it is interesting how other, you get down the leagues, because I mentioned earlier, US sports, how premium the pricing is. I mean, you will spend, right? If, so my local college NFL, local American football team, University of Washington, as a non-student, if I want to go there, I'm probably going to spend over $100 to go to a student game. I know. Yeah, it's mad. Yeah. It's utterly mad. Actually, I get very good value. My hyper-local Tier 4 team, so semi-pro, basically. You get a few players each year making it into the professional ranks. It's $200 for a season ticket for the men's and women's team, and that will probably work out at 20-something games. So it's pretty good value. That is actually not the case in some lower league English clubs, right? So some of them famously are charging £25 a go, and they're happy to have very low crowds because they've I guess they've worked out the price elasticity. It works out better than charging 10 quid a ticket. It's like madness, but there you go.
No, so I think these are all the kind of second and third order derivatives that the IFR is going to have to really carefully consider, and I don't think it's easy. My overall thinking can probably be summarised as how do you want football clubs to be funded? Do you want them to fund themselves, or do you want significantly wealthy private individuals or investors funding it? Because that's effectively where you end up.
Yeah, absolutely. And it cascades all the way down the league. So the share of money that the EFL, that's not equitable either, right? So 85% of that goes to the Championship. And so League One and League Two clubs are left with having to rely on owner funding, or they end up in court with HMRC trying to wind them up, which has happened way too often. Yeah. All right. We'll leave it there. We've managed an hour of finance chat.
How do we do it? How do we do it every time?
Hit the subscribe button if you can, especially on YouTube. You need to build that audience there. But if you happen to be listening to this in an audio app and you're not subscribed, do so. You'll get all this lovely stuff in your feed. We've, of course, got the real football coming up. So there will be the weekend match review show with Tom. After Hull, we have a new women's football show we're going to be producing from September onwards. It'll be a monthly with Andy Slater from the Barmy Article fanzine. There you go, building the NQAT media empire here. How much can I sell it to? Who shall I sell it to?
Jeff.
Yeah, Jeff, if you add a couple of zeros. Yeah. We'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Jamie.
Thanks a lot, Ed.
Thanks, everyone. Bye now.